All right. So, hopefully you found that demo helpful and informative, even though I wasn't talking throughout the demo. And like I had said, that was meant to be just a warm up where I was focusing, just to kind of get the brain going and kind of get my color mixing going. And but ended up, I thought it would be better in the long run to show something like that in combination with maybe a couple other demos down the road here. So hopefully you found it useful. I do apologize for not finishing the vase and some of the corrections that I did on the pear in front of you. I had not checked my phone, which was what I'm recording on before I started recording, which I usually do, space-wise, just because I was just, like I said, warming up, and the camera had at some point stopped recording when I was working on, in particular, this part of the vase and reshaping some of that size of the pear. So I apologize for you not being able to see that. I will be posting this finished painting with some other materials on our Blackboard and via Dropbox for you all, so you can look at it yourself. I took a photo of it and put it on this screen here with the image up above, so that I can draw on it, point some things out, and talk about a few things. This process that we're doing now, so in addition to, like I had mentioned, it is really helpful to spend time reviewing your reference that you're going to be working from, looking at these things, seeing what's available for you, color-wise and composition, value, kind of mentally working through the reference or the object that you're going to be painting that's in front of you as much time as you can. And it's also helpful, especially in the shorter or faster painting sessions like this one. It's really helpful to sit down and kind of review it afterwards. You're not going to be able to do everything in a shorter painting necessarily, so it's good to just kind of look at it and decide what worked, what didn't work, and look for things that you think are interesting, or see what came out from your reviewing of the reference or the objects, what came out in a faster painting session. So you can really learn quite a bit, I think, when doing that. With a longer painting, you're kind of reviewing all along the way because you're doing it multiple days in a row. So it's definitely more so for these faster ones, reviewing your decisions and the outcome. Can prove very helpful. So that's kind of what we're going to do here. I'm also going to kind of go over, in addition to talking about what kind of worked and areas that I, could change or improve, or things that I could think about next time I were to paint this, if I were to set up different parameters for what I was focusing on. We're also going to kind of review the process and of how I constructed the painting, and kind of some of the things that I was thinking, just in case it wasn't as obvious in the video. I know it seemed fairly, very fast paced, and I'm doing that. I didn't know until I watched the video of myself that I wave my brush, what appears to be randomly, in front of the canvas a bunch before I make a mark. And really what I'm doing there is just kind of thinking about the direction of the mark that I'm going to do, and kind of visualizing it and kind of keeping that hand and that pace moving, and then kind of jump in and make that mark, is what I'm doing. I just didn't know I did it so frequently, which was kind of funny to see. But although the process is very fast paced, and I kind of approached different parts, different objects in different parts of the painting a little bit differently, which I'll break down here. I was still fairly systematic in how I did it, so I just wanted to talk about that because I think that might be helpful for you understanding the process of building the form and applying the paint and the color temperatures and things like that. I do really would like to do another demo here if time allows, now that I have the kind of setup figured out a little bit better, where I do a little more of a structured and methodical approach as opposed to my own as I've dubbed it, revisionist process, kind of how I like to do it in my own work. So I'll try to get that done for you as well. But that being said, so if we were to look at kind of how I approach things, so, I started, down in the cloth, right? So, and when I did the fabric, I started there just because it kind of is an area of the painting that is related to everything. It's a very large shape. The color is related to, affects almost everything in there because there's so much of it. I started there, and I started in the background as well. Knocking in that background was important just because for the same purpose, right? It is one of the more dominant colors and shapes that affect everything in the painting. So, when I did the fabric, I was for the most part thinking plainly. All of this, the goal in my mind that I was focused on was just really getting my color brain going, so that I could demo color and talk about color shifts and temperature shifts and saturation and that sort of thing. So that was my main purpose with this. And then everything else was just kind of what happened. And I think like when I was working this fabric, I started, with this temperature and this area here because it's the lightest and the warmest. And then, I was thinking plainly, the shifts of the planes as they're happening, but I've kept it fairly simple and loose. This isn't one of the more important objects in the painting, so keeping the detail more minimal in that area is a little bit more beneficial for the time being. If I were to take it further, I could decide how much detail to put in that fabric because there are some really nice folds and spatial aspects to it. But knocking in this initial warmth and bright, and then darkening and slightly cooling as I move this way, and then then moving back into this space, getting even cooler as I move back, and a little bit darker as well than here. I probably could have pushed that even a little bit more dark to push that back in space, but if you look at just the color temperatures, in addition to the values, there's a nice spatial distance there. So, by getting this warmer initial area in, my main one, that's the most important because it's so close to the main focal points, and hit with the most light, by getting that kind of knocked in and established, then I was able to adjust as I moved this way and constantly compare and shift what was right next to it pretty systematically. And from there, even with the shadows, knocking this in nice and cool, and then warming as I go this way, and then as well as a little bit of lightening, and then a little bit of back to the dark and a little more warmth to it as it goes under that fold of that shadow, or a little bit cooler. So it's, cooler, warmer, and then a little bit cooler. Again, not quite as cool as back here, so that this is, a dark fold there, but it is closer to the picture plane, so it could get warmer to bring it in front of these back here. And then systematically, once I kind of got that knocked in, I think I might have thrown in that shadow there, and I tried to keep that kind of cooler. And then from there, I started pushing this direction and started cooling as I went. And this photo is a little bit redder than the actual painting. But I started cooling as I went this way and tried to keep it a little bit darker on this edge here and a little bit warmer, and then back here a little bit cooler and a little bit lighter, so that there is a spatial difference between this edge and this edge as well. So the whole time thinking about those saturations and temperatures in the shadows, and being pretty systematic about it is nice to kind of establish something that you can compare to. So finding, working like object or like form aspects, so shadows versus lights, or all of the fabric at once. And then from there, I jumped to the background and started knocking in those darks. And when you watch the palette, when I'm mixing, you can see that I am adjusting my black. I'm mixing ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and the ivory black together in different amounts. And what I chose to do was to make this more red and push it more into the blue spectrum. So this had like red and blue, red and blue, red and blue, red and blue in both 3 quadrants, but it was getting more blue as we went this way. And my thought with that is that I wanted this area to be warmer and feel closer, and I even put a little bit of yellow down in here with a teeny bit of a little extra blue to kind of kick it into the green to bring this space closer than this part of the fabric that's directly above it. So I started adding a little more red and a little more blue as it went up, and then more blue as it went to the left. My thoughts with that were that I wanted that right side of the black to be warmer, feel closer, and I really wanted to push the space back here so that this felt very far away from this to kind of exaggerate that feeling of depth going back this way. I'm not sure I like that I did it that way. The other way that I could have done it is maybe pushing this more blue and then slowly pushing more into the, this would be a red blue leaning more towards the red, and then over here almost more red and black and just a little bit of blue. The reason that could have been interesting is that had I pushed this a little more blue and let this space feel further away, by having blue in here, that would have allowed me, I don't think I got neutral enough and kind of light enough in this area. And had I think the saturation between here and here is feeling pretty good, but that this could have been quite a bit lighter and a teeny bit more neutral. Could have thrown a little bit of blue into it so that this would have been more dominant and this would have felt closer to the light source. I could have pushed a little bit more of the yellow in here. And had this been blue dominant instead of red dominant, that would have it would have felt more of like a complementary color thing going on here, where this would start to feel more orange had it been next to a blue, and would allow me to get lighter and a little more neutral, but still have it feel saturated. So remember, color is relative. So if this had more of a blue, and the background had more blue hue, it would affect how orange this would look even when I desaturated and lightened it. So, and then as we move this way, that same thing would have happened. Had this been more red here, then this would start to feel, if we look at the difference between this is a yellow green and in general it's got a blue to it. It feels definitely more blue when you look at them back and forth to one another, but it also has just a really nice warm green going on to it, but it needs to be pushed into the blue, one, so that it feels further away, two, that it feels different than the pear. And had I pushed the red aspect of it, then even as it would allow me to push mix green that is more blue for that vase, but that here, hold on, let me get rid of some of this. I'm getting a little mark crazy because it's fun. So had I pushed this more into the red and then this even more into the red, that would allow me to make this vase mix colors that are a little more into the blue-green, but because of the red around it, it would make this feel even more green as I did so, because of it being right next to the red dark. And I still think that the spatial difference between here and here would have stayed intact. This still would have felt far away. This would have felt closer. I think even if I had done it that way, I'm not certain, if I did this painting again or did a longer version of it, maybe when I do the demo of the more structured approach, I can try swapping it and see which one I like. But just having that kind of variance back there is important. If it was all just a flat black, would get kind of boring. So even when you're doing something as simple as a black, thinking about the temperature of it and how it will affect the colors around it is a good thing to do. If this was red too, you could see that gray that's here would start to look a little more green, which it does in the photo that I was working from. So that also is another reason maybe to have pushed that more red than blue. But anyway, and then from there I jumped into the pear, and I kind of hit my saturation pretty hard and pretty fast, the most saturated area, kind of right in here. Because this is a glowing pear, it's my main focal point, and I wanted to make sure that it was high enough up in saturation and value. So I knocked that in first, and I worked on this one really planarly to start, right? So I was knocking in the planes as it shifted down in saturation and value as I worked around, and then I started breaking up some of those planes to get some of the horizontal planes that roll, not these planes, but these planes that roll around, and some of the nuance of it. I started kind of working on, and once I felt like I got that somewhat established, then I jumped onto the boot. Now the boot, instead of the first thing that I did was I kind of found a path of saturation that rolled down to my most saturated area. That gave me something really quick just to kind of compare things to as I built it. And I'd say in general, I didn't work very planarly on this one. So if you remember from our demos, we have the planar approach, and then we have the more indirect gestural alla prima approach. And then and that approach is very similar to how we would work with our charcoal, right? When in our drawing class, where we're pushing and pulling and adjusting and building our form from the dark to the light and applying the light on top of a form that's already been established as far as building the lights or darks up to the lights. So that's how I kind of worked this one more than say that this is the more planar one. And then this one I did more of the tiled approach. I was getting a little bit tired and getting a little sloppy, which I kind of like. I think it's an interesting hybrid of the boots approach and the pairs approach, kind of doing a little more tiled but thinking planar and a little bit gestural. But in general, this felt a little more tiled in how I was thinking about it, but definitely could have used a little more time on that vase. But so after I hit this kind of saturated path that was here, then I immediately jumped up to this part of the boot and I started working my way down. I wanted this, it was really important for me for this painting that this whole area up here felt very, it felt warm, it felt brown, it felt part of the boot, but that it felt not saturated, and it felt like it was leaning away from and allowing this to glow more. So I worked my way down, and I had a subtle value of saturation here that, that saturation path that I did changed. I don't think I did it all in one brush stroke, but I created that path to compare things to, and then desaturated and then slowly saturated as I moved this way, and also saturated as I moved this way. Now this, like I said, it got a little bit too dark and a little bit too saturated and is competing with this spatially. But after I did that, desaturation, more saturated, and then moved this way to a lighter and different hue. So after that, then I started knocking in kind of the bigger planar shapes, bigger planar values, and really focusing on the value and the temperature of the spaces next to one another, kind of merging the bigger transitions that I had initially done, but looking more at the bigger planes. And then after that, I started to really look at the transitions. And so transitions, when I say transitions, I'm talking about the subtle value shifts and some of the temperature changes that are happening, looking for those high saturations of where things are rolling right before they go into the shadow, getting nice and saturated, but constantly comparing them to one another and going back and adjusting areas that were looking too similar. So, when you're painting, if you find yourself let's say you mix this color here, and then all of a sudden you're just kind of getting into it, and you just start putting that color here, and that color here, and then maybe here. It's all going to start to look really flat, and it's going to start to negatively affect the colors that are around it, because this color here is not right for all of this area. So you want to watch out for that. And throughout the whole process, I was constantly kind of jumping back and comparing. Anytime I made new strokes, kind of looking at other areas that were similar in value, but in a different space, a different distance from the light source. So, and then started at that point, after when I was working on the transitions and some of those color adjustments, I started looking, at correcting some of the drawing and fine-tuning some of the edges a little bit more. And again, I was working pretty fast for myself. And was doing a bunch of adjustments along the way. I prefer to kind of work in that manner of constant adjustments as I go. But that was my basic thought process with this. And then on the vase, I started with what I thought was kind of the color that was most dominant all over the vase, which is roughly right around in here. And then I worked my way up, getting warmer, getting some of the reflective color of the boot in here, and getting darker as I went up. Then I got these, the local color of the vase, that nice kind of cooler blue, and knocked that in the back, put some of that there. Then pushed the saturation along this edge and worked on building the form, turning this way on the vase. And then came down here and started knocking in this nice warm dark that was on that. And right after that, I jumped into my shadow, mixed in more neutral version of my shadow, right? So remember, it's going to be more saturated on the light side and more neutral on the shadowed side of an object, relatively speaking, right? So if we look at this shadow side to this shadow side to this shadow side, this has the most saturation closest to the light. It's still desaturated relative to the light side of the object, but then when we compare them to each other, it's getting less saturated in the shadows as it moves back in space too, relative to the other object's shadows. So still thinking about all of that as I build the form, and so I knocked in that shadow. Then I came in and I pushed my terminator more strongly so that I could start seeing that form better. And then I came in and started looking for, and this is what you didn't see, but I started looking for some variety of warm cools in that shadowed side. Not as many varieties as I did over here, but enough to kind of help show that that wasn't just a flat, neutral shape. I definitely could have spent more time, I think this object could have got quite a bit darker in here, and quite a bit warmer and darker here, so that I had a little bit more of a better transition. And you can see how hard that shadowed edge is there. It's almost the same hardness, if not more, than the hardness of these, which are all cast shadows. So that's not working. Had I had more time and been paying attention a little bit more, I would have softened some of that and taken this a little bit darker overall, maybe a teeny bit warmer. But that was kind of my thought process. I know some artists will actually, like I did in this spot, will do this approach where they basically will mix a fairly decent large batch of what they think the local color of each object is, and then mix, have their primaries out and some secondaries. I didn't mix any secondaries. I was just kind of mixing as I went, but have some primaries, secondaries, and then mix a couple, 3 batches or maybe 4, including the cloth, of what they thought the local color of each object was, and then basically use that as the main puddle of paint that you mix from and adjust it in different piles as you're painting, and have that local value to build off of. So that's an approach that some people will use, and it can be useful to do some pre-mixing like that, so give it a shot if you would like. So that was kind of my thought process as I was going through the paintings. As far as some things that I think in general, the color temperatures and the things that we discussed in the reference, the transition of going from more, and this should be more pinks and yellow, to a more local color here, right? More saturated to these kind of yellow greens, and then having this get more neutral because it's catching the reflective color off of the vase. All of that I think is looking pretty good and getting desaturated as we go this way. And this gets a little bit more saturated, but not as much as this. But then this gets desaturated and darker as it goes back. I think those things look pretty good. With most of the objects, I think that the pear's looking pretty good. How it's getting blue, moving into the warms up here. How it's transitioning and getting more neutral as it's rolling this way. Probably could have punched my saturation just a little bit more on that inside edge right before the terminator. And I'm not 100% sold on the temperature of these shadows here. I would come back and reevaluate those. They work fine because they're just neutral and dark, but I think that they had room to be pushed a little bit more into a little bit more blues, and I didn't put the reflective light in there, so that'd be another thing, is maybe just push the reflective light a little bit more here, a little bit more here, push this shadow just a touch more, and I think the temperature variety that's in here feels pretty good. Darken this, maybe a little bit more green. I did adjust the difference between here and here, made this warmer and a little bit lighter. And I think had this gotten a little bit darker and greener, that space would feel a little bit better. But that's all detail stuff too in a lot of ways. And so, I think keeping my focus on the color based on saturation, based on temperature and good local relationships. I think as far as that's concerned, it feels pretty good. But those would be some of the things that I would adjust or change, this area here. Like I said, the shadow and the pear. So those are the things that when I'm just looking at it now would be things that I would adjust or consider to pay attention to more closely. Should I reapproach this painting and add more layers to it to fine tune it more? Or if I were to do a speedy painting and be a little bit more methodical and slow, those are things I would adjust or think about. And that black background for sure. It'd be fun to kind of see where I could take that. So, and then I guess I'd also say that we can talk about it, but edges, I think I could pay a little bit more attention to the edges of a painting. So edges are a great way to show space, to reinforce space, to make things feel closer or further. So like, for example, this is a nice sharp edge right here. And you look at the photo, there's a really crisp edge right there. And then right here where that shadow is, it's the fold of the boot going back in space. It almost becomes black in the photo as well. So that would be an example of a soft edge, right? So we have a soft edge there and a hard edge here. And I also did it, there's some harder edges on the pear here and some nice softer edges here. And then a hard edge here, a soft edge here, right? So it might have been nice to have another hard edge here, then this feels soft, and then that gets hard. So it's good when you have an object where you do have this, there's a hard edge there where it's alternating, where it's hard, soft, hard, soft, hard, soft, hard. Gives it good variety, but it also gives you a depth of space, right? So if we look back at the boot, this hard edge here compared to the softer edge here, this starts to pull in front of, these edges of that backside of the shadowed part of the boot. This edge, sharper edge here, pulls in front of this just based on edges. So hard edges pull forward, soft edges go back. You can achieve edges by variety of edges by either doing values, so having similar values will make edges soft, as opposed to more extreme values will make edges hard. You can also do it by, if we look at the pear, by allowing the paint to kind of mix together. As you're painting, it will create a soft edge as well. I think in general, if you know you're going to be working alla prima or indirectly, it's best to kind of keep it loose and mostly soft edges everywhere. And then tighten as you go, sharpen as you go where it's needed. It's easier to tighten than it is to soften for the most part. I mean, you can soften with just one big fat dry brush stroke. I wanted to soften that. I just one big brush stroke over both the black and that brown to soften them and kind of mix them together. You can do, but I think in general it's easier to sharpen as you go than it is to soften as you go. And it is easier if you're working indirectly to keep it softer initially, and then when it dries to come in and push your sharpness. So another way you can get that sharpness in your painting is to think about the physicality of the paint. So what's on top of what. So let's say I paint my black in a little bit when I do it, and then when I know I want this to be a hard edge, paint my black inside, and then know that I'm going to paint my light right on top of it with a really hard brush stroke edge right there. We'll pull that in front. So that's another way to sharpen things, is to think about the physicality of what's on top of what when you're painting, or even just have like the black stops there hard, and then the light stops there hard, so you get kind of like two waves crashing into each other of paint to give you a nice sharp edge there. So that'd be something that would be a fun challenge to do. I'm going to do a 2-hour painting or 1 hour painting and really focus on my edges. That'd be a great challenge to do. So that'd be, something I think I could push further in this, especially on this vase. I think the edges of the shadowed side are a little bit too hard. The edges of the shadows too hard. The contour, I meant, of that shadowed side of the contour is too hard. And there's not much variance along this edge all the way down. So that'd be something that vase is kind of lacking, and especially since it's the furthest object away. I think the edges down here are looking pretty good, but it's mostly based on value, not brush stroke. So I think that's room for improvement there. So those are things that I think I could improve, and hopefully things that are helpful for you when looking at your own work or deciding how you want to approach things. And so where do I go from here? So this approach, was just a very quick study, I guess you could say, but this approach would work great for even a long-term painting. You're working indirectly, so you're going to focus on value and temperature relationships. In the next layer, you would come in and start looking at even more softer transitions and deciding based on hierarchy of focal points, objects related to each other, hierarchy of focal points, but then even object related to itself, right? So you can start putting in detail here, a little bit here, but less detail, still information, but not higher contrast as you move back. Start deciding where you want to kind of push things, start organizing the smaller minor planes better, related to the larger planar shapes that exist on your boot. So, and you can do that on that next layer and take this as detailed as you want, layer by layer. The best way, so as we're talking about approach or application, whether you're doing a more planar or a more gestural or a more tiled approach, the more you go towards detail, the more you're going to start doing more of a tiled approach, because you're doing kind of smaller adjustments. And remember, basically every time there's a plane change, there will be a corresponding value, hue, and temperature shift in the area that you're working. So you're going to be working more tiled. So you could do the whole painting more gestural like this, then do another layer on top where you're getting a little more tiled with a little bit of gestural mixed in, and then the next layer you're really starting to get nuanced on subtle shifts across from one object to the next. And just like with the drawing, the challenge is adding more information, adding more, whether it's a high value shift and a high temperature shift, or a real subtle one. You want to make sure that you still keep the overall established aspects intact as you move that forward. So that'd be, where you could go next. And then I also just wanted to point out, one thing that's was fun in doing this. I learned so much. I think I've talked with some of my students about this because I try to implement this in my class. And, my plan with you, had we continued on, would be we were going to be doing quick studies where I was going to have you paint one object for 1 hour, then paint the same object for only a half an hour, then paint the same object for only 15 minutes, and then paint the same object again for only like 7 minutes. So cutting it in half as you move down. You can learn so much by painting quickly. And you learn even more if you combine that with also working on a very long, slow, more hours spent looking at the subtle details. If you do a painting like that and alternate between fast and, intuitive responding, mixed in with having some more long-term paintings going. Anytime I've had that combination in my classes, or I've had that aspect in my own studio practice, I've seen huge improvements. So if you're looking for a quick path of growth, getting a combination of those two things, long slower painting, where you really get nuance on things, and then also quick, fast ones where you set a timer, you pick an intent, because like I said, you can't do everything in a short painting. So picking a goal, be like, I am going to focus on value and composition, or I'm going to focus on value and edges, or I'm going to focus on color temperatures and constant shifting, or spatial depth where color and value, picking a goal and setting a time limit and really pushing hard to try to achieve as much as you can in that period of time, and then step back and take a look at it, and see how you did. You're going to see where your strengths are. You're going to see what you're not grasping and what you should be focusing on to kind of get better at. And then you're also going to start to see, I think, in my opinion, style. You'll start seeing a little bit more voice coming out than what you might see in the more labor-intensive or slower paintings where you're kind of controlling things more. So you'll also start kind of getting a better feel for like what's your intuitive response to color, what you like and what you don't like. So I do really recommend doing faster paintings and combine that with some slower paintings. I think would be a good thing to do if you want. You're more than welcome to you've all been working on this longer painting, where we started together with the burnt sienna, the open grisaille, and then we went on to the gray mixture of the burnt sienna, the ultramarine, and the white to create the closed grisaille, and then paint the color on top of it. So that could be a slower long-term painting if you want. Set up a still life, pick a landscape or whatever your subject that you want it to be, and do 2 or 3 1-hour fast paintings and turn them all in, or just turn one in, or that would be a great option for having the 2 paintings that you're turning in for your grade. I'd love to see both, and it's kind of nice having some faster, shorter ones where they aren't as you don't feel like they're as precious. They're could be tossed away, no problem, but you'll learn so much even from the ones that don't work out well. So definitely, if you're interested in it, go for it. Don't be afraid. You're going to have some bad ones, and you're also going to have some good ones. So celebrate the good. Don't hate on the bad. Look for what you like and what didn't work, and use that information. So that's my last little bit of advice for the night. But I hope you all are doing well. I hope that was helpful. It could be good to watch this whole thing through once and then go back and just watch the demo again, the actual painting after you've heard the review and listened to the lecture and watched it once, and watch it again. That's the cool thing about art, is not everything needs to be explained verbally. If you know what you're supposed to be looking for, you can see what's being done and know why it's being done. So yeah, hopefully this is helpful. I hope you're all doing well, and look forward to seeing some more work. All right, take care.